Hello, Internet friend. Today on Value Side, President Trump's challenge, how to return the economy to normal after years of unrelenting stimulus. I'm David Ravel. Well, can President Trump manage the economy if it begins to slow? It's an important question, and one that will likely determine the success or failure of his second term in office. Historically, the federal government boosts the economy any time they see a projected recession. But President Trump is removing much of that fiscal stimulus with his push to streamline government and reduce waste. Like a man on the high wire, he is increasing the risk of recession exponentially. Here's the story of how this all came about. First, the Keynesian strategy. It's a strategy first proposed by economist John Maynard Keynes in the 1920s. After the Wall Street crash of 1929, President Franklin Roosevelt's administration, following this untested Keynesian strategy, boosted the federal spending from less than 3% of GDP to nearly 8% by 1932. This dramatic flood of dollars, labeled priming the pump, helped boost the economy from a general depression. Historians are quick to point out that World War II finally ended the Depression with its excessive stimulus during the 1940s. At the peak of the war spending, the federal government spent 40 cents on every dollar in the economy. It was stimulus on steroids. Now, by the end of the war, Washington was convinced that the way out of economic hardship was to have the federal government spend, spend, spend. Of course, much of this spending was through issuing government bonds, borrowing our way to prosperity, if you will. For nearly 80 years, Washington managed the economy this way. At the hint of a coming recession, the federal government would boost its spending to put dollars into circulation, priming the pump, and leading the economy to better times. Throughout the remainder of the 20th century, a benchmark came to be used. It was generally assumed, at least in practice, that as long as the government kept its stimulus levels below 20% of GDP, that was acceptable, and the country could recover. Aside from two blips under Presidents Reagan and Bush first, the nation adhered to this benchmark. Fiscal stimulus did not exceed 20% of the economy. This provided much-needed discipline to the government spending. And then, in 2008 came the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis and the corresponding recession of 2007 and 9 resulted from the loss of asset values. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by 45%. And the price of the average American home also declined commensurate. Anyone relying on these types of assets to secure their loans found themselves in trouble. Banks, savings and loans, and mortgage lenders of all kinds began to foreclose on underwater loans, loans that did not have sufficient collateral to be secured. Several major financial institutions, including Citibank, were in danger of closing. The thought that one of the nation's big four banks and a couple of major brokers would go out of business started a wave of panic selling in the markets. Once again, the federal government was called on to boost spending, fiscal stimulus, if you will, just like Keynes said. Within days, the government spent over 24% of GDP, the highest level of spending since World War II, 60 years before. However, more money was needed to boost the economy, so Washington looked to the Federal Reserve. Treasury asked the Federal Reserve to provide $1 trillion to stem the tide, which they did. This brought the Federal Government Reserve's balance sheet, assets they held, if you will, to over $2 trillion, the highest level they ever recorded up to that time. Now, Washington was provided two levels of stimulus: fiscal stimulus, that's that Keynesian thing we talked about, and quantitative easing. This is the Federal Reserve's banks, which expanded their assets to $2 trillion. We were now on our way to becoming a stimulus-dependent economy. From 2008 onward, the old ceiling of 20% of GDP spending became the new floor, with fiscal spending exceeding that level almost every year since. It was as if we couldn't live without that extra economic boost that stimulus provided. Stimulus that now came from both the Federal Reserve and the federal government. Of course, none of the politicians dared ask this new economy. Stimulus made everything hum, financial markets rallied and the price of homes climbed, and the balance sheet for the wealthy grew and grew. But what might happen if the stimulus was removed? No one dared ask that question. And then came the COVID-19 crisis. Regrettably, just 12 years after the global financial crisis, America was hit with yet another catastrophe, the COVID-19 pandemic. The leaders in Washington and many state capitals urged citizens to stay home if possible. Non-essential businesses were shuttered, and commercial activities ground to a halt. The second quarter of 2020 saw the economy decline by 30% annualized, a drop worse than the Great Depression. Again, the federal government and the Federal Reserve came to the rescue. Only this time, they outdid themselves. The federal treasury spent like there was no tomorrow. In 2020, over 30% of all expenditures in America came from the federal government, while the Federal Reserve pumped over $5 trillion into the financial markets, bringing the central bank's total assets to over $9 trillion, by far the highest level ever. None of this would surprise President Trump. After all, he was there at the beginning of COVID. While much of the world has seen dramatic changes since Trump's last term in office, changes such as the war in Ukraine and Gaza, from an economic perspective, much of the same trends continue from when he left his first term in the White House. Fiscal spending has declined from 30% to its current 23%, and that's a good thing. And the Federal Reserve's asset level has dropped from $9 trillion to $7 trillion, another good thing. These two moves indicate that the Federal Reserve and quantitative easing have been reduced, a much-needed trend to regain a regularly functioning economy. Today, President Trump's challenge. I'm sure that Trump welcomes both of these moves. However, he is asking for much, much more. The heavily touted DOGE team continues to chip away at a bloated bureaucracy promising to reduce fiscal stimulus even more. Trump's suggestion that the Fed lower interest rates would help reduce the interest burden on both the Fed's balance sheet and the country's overall interest expense. In less than a month's office, Trump has made it apparent that he wants to reduce government spending. That's the same as reducing fiscal stimulus, and likely reduce quantitative easing, the Fed's balance sheet. Until today, he's been the first politician willing to take those steps. For 16 years, Washington has behaved as if the global financial crisis never ended, piling unsustainable debt upon unsustainable debt, inflating asset prices while burdening those who pay taxes. With every move he makes to streamline government and remove waste, Donald Trump reduces the fiscal stimulus. It's an overdue process that is essential for America's long-term financial viability. We can only wish him well, but it won't be without pain. And that's today's Value Side. For all of our articles, references, and podcasts, visit valueside.com. I'm David Ravel. ValueSide is independently written and researched. The views expressed are strictly my own.